Welcome everybody. Happy, Shabbat Shalom. And
Shabbat Shalom.
thank you. Thank you. So we have another week's Torah portion. This week is Bo. That is this week's
Ah,
Torah portion. And Bo means it's like to come, but like in here it's being used by God instructing Moses to come in front of Pharaoh. And just to provide some context of what's going on in this week's Torah portion, we mentioned last week there were the first 7 of the plagues, and the
yes, yes,
first three of which, very curiously, Moses was not the
involved.
yeah, he was not the executor of these. These final 3, God tells Moses, go to Pharaoh, ask him to let us go. And it's interesting because the 8th and the 9th, Moses actually does go to Pharaoh, and then I don't remember right off the top of my head, but the 10th one, it's really unclear. Moses definitely at some point said like never sees Pharaoh again, because that 10th plague is effective in
Yes,
Pharaoh changing his mind or less hardening of his heart and allowing the Jews, the Israelites, to depart. I do want to point out one of the, for me, a fascinating aspect of this week's Torah portion is I think it's so popular in people's minds. It's so ingrained in people's minds about the phrase "Let my people go,"
yes,
right? And yet
yes.
it's only a part of the phrase, because the truth is it's a little bit longer than that. There's actually more to the phrase. It's not simply let my people go. It's so this is, I'm going to go back to, even though this week's Torah portion starts with chapter 10, but I just going backwards to chapter 9 in last week's Torah portion. God tells Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go and serve me. So it's really just 4 words. Shalach et ami v'yavduni. Send my people, let my people go. It's interesting. It's not so much let my people go, but send them
It's
forth.
serve him,
Send
to
them forth,
serve him.
right? And then v'yavduni, and then they serve me. So it's not simply they're going to
Ah,
just get rid of them, cut
go
ties with them,
anywhere.
but
They need to serve God.
right. And it's part of the relationship between God and the Israelites, that
Yes,
God is getting them out, and they're going to take part in this relationship with God through service. And
yes.
I think that's something that's often missed in part of telling the story, that it's not simply letting them go or sending them forth, but also this aspect of service, of a relationship. Okay, so
Now, isn't that true today? Let my people go, but serve me.
right, it's
All right,
not
isn't that let out? Aren't we supposed to serve God in any way we can, which is service to God in volunteering, in whatever? Is that correct
so that's
today?
so I'm gonna, the context of this, the service referenced here, is not it is specifically offering sacrifices. That's the specific context of.
Oh,
So, for instance, what we see, it's really interesting in this week's Torah portion, that Pharaoh. So, for instance, Moses beseeches Pharaoh, "Hey, let us go, and we want to serve. We want to serve God, so or offer sacrifices." So it's interesting. In chapter 10, verse 8, Moses and Aaron went back to Pharaoh, and he says, "Fine, go worship the Lord your God." Who are the ones who are going to go and be doing the service? So Moses responds to him in verse 9, we will all go, young and old. We'll go with our sons and daughters, our flocks and herds, for we must observe the Lord's festival. And then and then Pharaoh responds, yeah, no, not the children. Clearly you are bent on mischief. No, you men folk go and worship the Lord, since that is what you want. And then they were kicked out from in front of Pharaoh. So, and then what happens in the very next verse is the eighth plague, the locusts. So Moses is requesting that, is beseeching Pharaoh, requesting the entirety of the Jewish people, not just the men, women also, and children, and the livestock, everybody, everything, to go out and provide their and serve through sacrifices to God. Now Pharaoh here is very gender distinctive. No, just the men. You men can go do that. The women and the kids, no. They have to stay back here in Egypt. Clearly, that is not what Moses is asking. That is a non-negotiable aspect of the conversation here. And that's it. And so plague number 8 comes along. So I think that's an interesting aspect. I think.
Yes, I do too.
Yeah, even in this first chapter of this week's Torah portion, it becomes really interesting. I think it's oftentimes lost in how we tell the story of the departure from Egypt, that Pharaoh here in this first chapter of this week's Torah portion is willing to let the men go and do that service, except Moses is asking for everybody.
Everybody.
Is everybody, in
Right.
which Pharaoh was not comfortable with. And so that's that's what we see happen. And it's interesting. I'm trying to look at what happens subsequently. Ultimately, we have dark. Obviously, the Choshech is the 9th plague, and anyways, ultimately, it's interesting. In chapter 10, verse 24, Pharaoh summoned Moses and said, "Go worship the Lord. Only your flocks and your herds shall be left behind. Even your children may go with you." In verse 25, but Moses said, "You yourself must provide us with sacrifices and burnt offerings to offer up to the Lord our God. Our own livestock too shall go along with us. Not a hoof shall remain behind, for we must select it from it for the worship of the Lord our God. And we shall not know with what we are to worship the Lord until we arrive there." But as we see in chapter 27, very next verse, the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not agree to let them go or to send them forth. And then we see in the very next verse, in verse 28, chapter 10, Pharaoh said to him, "Be gone from me, get out of here. Do never see me again, for the moment you look upon my face, you shall die." And the last verse of chapter 10, verse 29, Moses replies, "Yes, you have spoken correctly. I shall never see your face again." And then chapter 11, is the firstborn plague. So that's I think that's an important consideration in thinking about what is part of the story of letting people go. Pharaoh was okay with letting them go and doing some service, some worship with the flocks, with offering sacrifices, and yet Moses wanted everybody to be included in, who got sent.
Everything gone, actually.
Yeah, everything.
Because if you didn't take the livestock and the seed, then the people could not survive.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I think in the lead up to that 8th plague, I think Pharaoh understood what Moses was up to. He said, if you really just want to offer, just do this worship, do these sacrifices, go. Like, the men need to go. What are you involving women and children for? They have nothing to do with this. And so Pharaoh knew that there was something fishy going on, and he caught on. So I think we always read this, and Pharaoh is obviously totally a bad guy. His heart is hardened. And yet, I think at the same time, he knows what's going on. He doesn't want to let them go. And especially this workforce that he's got enslaved, providing all this manual labor for his building projects. He doesn't want to just give that up. He wants to hold on to it. He doesn't want to give this up. So that's to Pharaoh's credit. Obviously, he is not the protagonist. The Israelites are the protagonists. So he gets negatively portrayed here. So this is not even really the topic I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to transition now into what I do want to talk about, which is the very beginning of chapter 12. So what we have with the very beginning of chapter 12 is this something that I think can get overlooked pretty easily, which is The Lord says to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you. We do, of course, have Rosh Hashanah. That's true. But the year begins, so to speak, in the springtime with around Passover time. So
Right.
this is and it's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that we start the Jewish calendar this way. And one of the interesting things about this is a comment of the famed medieval commentator, perhaps the most famous Jewish commentator, biblical and Talmud commentator of really all time, is Rashi. And he has a really fascinating comment on the very first verse in the entirety of the Torah, Genesis 1:1. He says in the beginning, and he quotes from some Rabbi Isaac. Not really clear who this Rabbi Isaac is. He is not in the Talmud. He is not in rabbinic literature. It is somewhere that Rashi quotes him. He says, the Torah, which is the law book of Israel. So this Rabbi Isaac understands the Torah not so much from a narrative perspective, which is interesting. How much, I guess it brings forth a broader question. How much is the Torah to be considered merely, very simply, very narrowly a law book, and more expansively the story of the creation of our people, right? It's the Israelites, it's the children of Israel's origin story. So there's a lot more than simply the law code. But if one wanted to perceive the Torah as simply a law code, which it's not, because we have a lot of stories that are much more than simply laws, but the Torah, which is the law book of Israel, should have begun with the verse, what we have in this week's Torah portion of Exodus 12:2. This month shall be unto you the first of the months, which is the very first commandment. It's the very first mitzvah given to the Jewish people, to Israel, which is such a fascinating aspect. If we were to consider the entire book of Genesis, the first 11 chapters of the book of Exodus, if we were to say, let's just wipe it all out, because that's not relevant to this compendium of commandments, right? That's all irrelevant. We don't need to know this. We just need to know what we need to know. Of course, the problem with that is it's such a narrow understanding of what the Torah is and what its function is for our people. It's a lot more than that. I like to think of it as our origin story. And yes, it also has hundreds of instructions for us as a people and how we should live. I do want to say that do want to point out that a new month, Rosh Chodesh, is an important practice of our people. Rosh Chodesh, this new moon, we have. I find this comment interesting. We have, this is by Sforno. He is an Italian. I don't remember off the top of my head. He's an Italian commentator. Here we go. Ovadia ben Jacob Sforno was a early 16th century rabbi and in Italy. And here is his comment on this week's
starting right now.
All right, let me finish up. So what we have here, his comment is, from now on, these months will be yours to do with as you like. This is in contrast to the years when you were enslaved and you had no control over your time nor your timetable at all. While you were enslaved, your days, your hours, your minutes were always at the beck and call of your taskmasters, which is such an interesting way of marking freedom, right? It's when one is
right. It is.
Right.
It is.
When one is enslaved, you are not in control of your time.
No.
Right. And so
when you're free, you are.
Right. And so this is which really heightens the importance of marking the first month. It's also the first month of a people, of peoplehood. And I think that it's not simply at that time, it just happened to be, okay, restart your calendars at that time. It's also for every subsequent month ever in the history of the Jewish people, but also it's right. So we still do it, and it's still an important practice. We operate on a quasi-lunar, not a totally lunar, but also not a totally solar calendar either. And so the counting the months is important. And also we always reset our years back to the beginning of that first month in the spring, even though we do have Rosh Hashanah in the fall, which is a celebration of the new year to some extent, but we also have another
Right.
year in the spring around Passover, because that's when our people were created. That was the birth of our nation.
At Passover.
Yeah, around
The birth of our nation is at Passover.
Passover is in the middle of the month. So Passover is in the middle of the month, but it's that month.
Okay, may I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
If Passover is the mark of our birth of our nation, then why is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? Is that the birth of our nation too?
No, it is not. So it's funny because there's a debate in rabbinic literature as to when was the world created. And so there's a debate, is it more in the fall or is it in the spring? And
right.
They have each of their opinions. There's also in rabbinic literature they talk about there being 4 separate New Years, as it were. That we celebrate 4 separate New Years. Let me.
But Passover is the official one. And then what is our official one? The birth of our nation. Then what is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur?
In the Mishnah, that there are 4 New Years. There are 4 heads of the year. The first of Nisan is the new year for King, and Nisan is the month in which Passover is celebrated.
Okay.
And also for the festivals. So that restarts our festival cycle. So the Passover is our first festival, then Shavuot, and then Sukkot ultimately. And then the first of Elul is the new year for animal tithes. That's the second one. The third one is the first of Tishrei is the new year for counting years, which is Rosh Hashanah, right? So when we count years, that's how we count. And then the fourth one, which is actually coming up this coming week, is the new year for the trees. And there's a debate that Shammai's Academy says it's the first of the month of Shvat, and Hillel's Academy says it is the 15th of the month of Shvat. Now, that will be the final Thursday in the month of January for this year. So January 28th is Tu B'Shvat, and that's what we celebrate. So as it turns out, so this is airing on Friday and Saturday, right? Friday the 22nd and Saturday the 23rd. So the upcoming Thursday 28th will be Tu B'Shvat, will be this 15th of Shvat, in which we celebrate this new year for trees, which is directly relevant. It's in the coming week. But ultimately, in amongst the wisdom of the rabbis, they established 4 entirely separate years. They didn't say everything has one particular new year starting date, but there are different times for different things. The reason they have the tree new year in the dead of winter has to do with the rains and when plants start growing. And then, but as far as the springtime is when we have the new festival cycle begin for our people. In the fall with Rosh Hashanah is when we have what years are called, right, for calendrical purposes. So
right.
I don't know why they decided then. Maybe it has something to do with harvesting. It's a little bit.
Who knows?
Yeah, maybe for this coming Rosh Hashanah, I will do further research into that.
Yes.
Yes.
You do. I'm interested in it. I really want to know.
Fantastic.
Well, then our calendar that we follow today is set with the new year beginning January 1. That came from where did that come from?
Well, the calendar that's used in the Western world is currently called the Gregorian calendar.
That's it. That's what I just lost the word.
Which is named after Pope Gregory. I don't know what number he is.
Somebody.
Right, and that was done, I want to say, roughly 15th or 16th century, and that in itself was an updating of the Julian calendar, named after Julius Caesar, because it didn't properly account for the way that the leap years worked, because the Julian calendar operated off of a 365.24,
Whatever.
right, and it just
Yes.
didn't go past the first 2 decimal points, which is fine on a year-to-year basis, but over the course of centuries, I think it was like 15 centuries later, I
Yeah.
think it was Pope Gregory realized they needed to recalibrate it and account for the decimal places past the first 2 decimal places. So
Oh dear.
yeah,
Well, now
but whereas the
our
Jewish calendar,
calendar.
but both the Julian and Gregorian calendars work off our 100% solar calendar. The Jewish calendar, on the other hand, is primarily lunar, right? We have these months that work off of the lunar calendar. So when we say
Right.
this month will be the first month, it's based off of the moon. But at the same time, we are not 100% a lunar calendar. Now, as you know, who does use 100% a lunar calendar, which is the Muslims. Now, with that, they can have certain festivals or celebrations at any time of the year. So Ramadan could be in the winter, but it could also be in the fall or the summer or the spring. There's no consistency to when Ramadan or Eid al-Fitr or whatever these things happen. Whereas the Jewish calendar, there's always a range. So for instance, this year we have Purim occurring in February, Passover starting in March, although most years it's actually Purim is March, Passover is April. So this year everything's early. In fact, Hanukkah is starting the Sunday night of Thanksgiving weekend at the end of November. But the latest we see Hanukkah going is maybe the tail end of December into January, but it's just it's a range from late November to, going into the tail end of Hanukkah going into the beginning of January. But we never see Hanukkah in February or Passover in July.
No.
So every 19 there's a 19-year cycle where every few years we'll toss in another month just to balance it out to somewhat make sense with the solar calendar. So for instance, we have all these things occurring so early in 2021. In 2022, we're going to throw in another month to balance it out. Things will be later, but overall it'll be a balance. Because also Passover is meant to be celebrated specifically in the spring. And if we were 100% a lunar calendar, there would be years it would not be in the spring. So there's a bit of a correction in the system for that.
So now our calendar begins at Passover, correct?
Correct.
Basically.
Right. And it's really funny because Rosh Hashanah occurs in the 7th month.
Really? We jam
Yes.
this year. So how do we do? Well, never mind.
It's just
we'll talk about it later.
Yeah, it's a funny calendar.
It is crazy.
Yeah.
No wonder I don't quite know when whatever comes.
Yeah. Although, since we're speaking about funny calendars, it's funny when we think about the names of the months, right? September, October, November, December. Those months literally translate to the 7th month, the 8th month, the 9th month, the 10th month. But the reason that the 7th month through the 10th month are actually the 9th through the 12th month is because of the ego of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. Because the 7th through the 10th months should have been the 7th through the 10th months. But July was named after Julius Caesar, so they inserted that one to be the new 7th month. And then because of the ego or giving honor to Augustus Caesar, so Augustus Caesar had August named after him. So they inserted that into the 8th month. So the addition of these 2 months of July and August named after these 2 Caesars pushed off September, which is the 7th month, to be the 9th month. And October, which is the 8th month, to be the 10th month. And November, which is the 9th month, to be the 11th month. And December, Dece, which is 10, to be the 12th month. So that's also kind of funny. I mean, calendars are so
crazy,
fascinating. Yeah, they're very fascinating.
Well, thank you.
Righty. All right. Well,
thank
Shabbat
you
Shalom.
so much.
My pleasure.
Shabbat
and Shabbat
Shalom.
Shalom. Absolutely.
Shabbat Shalom.